Hello and welcome to the Coffee and Cocktails podcast. I'm your host, Dr. Ann Wand. We have the pleasure today of listening to Lecturer of Pakistan Studies at Comstock University in Islamabad, Sonia Gulzeb Abbasi, who will be talking with us today about concerns surrounding Muslim women's identity. But for this bonus episode, rather than ask what drink you were having for the show, Sonia, would you like to start?
All right. Thank you. Thank you for giving me this opportunity at your space. And I look forward to this episode.
Yeah, well, I'm looking forward to what you have to say. So feel free to dive in.
So basically, I will just try to put things into perspective that, being a Muslim woman myself, I was a little kid when the 9/11 happened, right? Back in the days. So, talking about the Muslim woman identity, it is very relevant to talk about history, what happened, and how this, the dilemma of Muslim woman identity transpired, right? So, in a politicized global context, in the decade after 9/11, the headscarf became a renewed focus of global debate. And in those contentions over the Muslim woman dress, the concerns about the immigration and assimilation were sort of expressed through the language of the women's rights, right? So, when 9/11 happened, I was not very mature enough to understand what is happening, right? And then I grew up and I started studying IR, and everything, what is happening in the world. And then I observed recently that nothing has changed. Even today, a lot of debates are framed through the women's right and the women's dress. For instance, recently, I'm not sure if you got a chance to go through what is happening on the social media. So Vogue France, basically the Instagram handle of the Vogue France, they recently shared a picture of a non-Muslim white woman wearing a headscarf. And the caption of that picture was, "Yes to the headscarf." And that sort of stirred a debate around the world that about the double standards of the France, that on one hand, that a lot of people argued that you are telling Muslim women not to wear hijab, and then you're telling a non-Muslim woman that it's fashion and vogue when a non-Muslim woman do it, and it becomes a threat when a Muslim woman wear hijab, right? So that, I was sort of very disappointed as well that even in today's world, in 21st century, Muslim women are still framed through these through their dress. Because obviously, even in religion, if we talk about religion, because we are talking about the dilemma of Muslim woman identity, even in Islam, there is no compulsion, right? You cannot tell women to wear a hijab or wear a burqa. Similarly, you cannot tell women to take off your hijab or your burqa. So these are the things which makes me really, disappointed. And then again, you might have heard about the recent, when the Taliban took control in Afghanistan after the US military's complete withdrawal from Afghanistan. Again, there was a sort of debate which started happening in the Western print and social media. Everyone sort of got concerned about the rights of the Afghan woman. They wanted to save Afghan women from the bearded brown Muslim men. I'm not suggesting that women are not sort of suffering under the Taliban regime. But, the Afghanistan issue is very multifaceted and, it's complex. And, analyzing it through the oppression and liberation lens of the Muslim woman it is a very restrictive framework. And it does not put forth any, sort of substantial solution for the Afghanistan humanitarian crisis. For instance, that was very interesting. I was just right now, before this podcast started, I was going through the Instagram handle of Angelina Jolie. She literally became active on Instagram. She posted her first picture on Instagram after Taliban took control in Afghanistan. And that picture was a letter from a Afghanistan teenage girl to the Angelina Jolie, apparently, that she was asking to save she was asking Angelina Jolie and the Western world to save us from Taliban, right? And 2 days ago as well, she shared a picture, a letter from a Afghan teen girl. Again, I mean, this is a good thing that, the world is, and the Western media is concerned about about the education of the Afghan girls and the Taliban regime. But you know where the Western world was when the Afghan woman was suffering under the US military occupation? And none of these women are talking about the prevailing humanitarian crisis or the crisis or they are not even talking about the complicity of the West and the US in Afghanistan, who created this mess at the first place. So everyone is concerned about the, women's right and women's education, which is a good thing. But again, this is one side. They're only looking at the problem from their own frameworks, which they want to see maybe. So I would like to, since we are talking about the dilemma of Muslim woman identity, the Muslim women are still struggling for a fair representation in the Western world. So the Western portrayal of the Muslim woman is like a homogeneous creature, right? Oppressed by her religion, culture, and men. No, there is a lot to Muslim woman than these connotations. And again, they are particularly framed through the debates of violence, veil, honor. Again, I'm not suggesting that there are no problems in the Muslim world. There are a lot of problems. There are a lot of patriarchal injustices to talk about in the Muslim world. Even the internal critique by the Muslim women, the feminist voices, they often criticize Muslim world that they could not even enable they could not even provide safe public spaces to the Muslim woman, which is true. Women are still struggling to find safe public spaces in the Muslim world. But again, how the Western way frame Muslim women, this is deeply problematic as well. Like, Muslim woman is not a monolithic identity. It has a lot of, every region, every culture has their own diverse set of Muslim woman identity. So again, I would like to, add the work of Leila Abu Lughod, who wrote a book, Do Muslim Women Need Saving, right? That book actually gave me language and framework to explore this phenomenon of Western hypocrisy and their deep desire to liberate Muslim women in order to authorize various forms of intervention, including military intervention. So her work was a very, very groundbreaking work, to comprehend this phenomenon of Western hypocrisy, how they use sort of the Muslim woman or the right. They talk about the rights of the Muslim woman in order to authorize their sort of military adventures in the Muslim world. And again, I would like to add the work of Sabah Mahmood as well. So who basically proposed a critique of white liberal, neo-imperialist, feminist, and anthropologist who would go to the Middle Eastern countries and who would study and analyze Muslim women from a diverse geography within their white liberal conceptual framework. So she sort of, observed this, that these white anthropologists and feminists, they would go to the Muslim world and they would suggest this, that if a Muslim woman is observant, she's oppressed. And likely if she is liberal, she's free. So she sort of deconstructed this European conception of Muslim woman. And then she said that let's, stop analyzing Muslim women through oppression and liberation lens. And she said a very beautiful thing, which personally, sort of resonated with my ideology, that For some Muslim women, the idea of freedom is submitting to the higher authority. Yeah. So not all women, but and I'll be honest, I've never came across any woman in my life who took hijab by force. I'll be honest, right? And I have hardly came across any woman who would practice their religion out of fear of their kin, right? For a lot of women, sticking to the religious belief was a form of empowerment, right? So again, we need to have these conversations. We need to have real conversations about the identity of the Muslim woman. For instance, I was heavily inspired by the work of Leila and Saba Mahmood, but there are those feminist voices in the Muslim world who are critical of Saba's and Leila's work. They often criticize them that how much support their work gave to the authentic feminist voices within the Muslim world, who are, actually working to challenge the patriarchal injustices in their countries, or who are working to reform, patriarchal laws, and who are, sort of changing a narrative there. Because, like I said, that there are a lot of problems regarding, Muslim women, sort of freedom. There are no safe public spaces in the Muslim world. Women have to struggle for that, and there are a lot of other patriarchal injustice as well. But I think this is, and again, the internal critique, the internal feminist voices from the Muslim world also, sort of criticize Leila and Saba by suggesting this, that these diaspora writers are oblivious to the real problems what the native women face. So I think it's a very sort of a very interesting debate, and then when we see certain feminist voices within the Muslim countries, they often, they see Western world as their savior as well. And when we try to argue with them that, see, the Western media and the Western feminists or anthropologists always dissect Muslim women through oppression and liberation lens, those internal feminist voices, they come up with this argument that, see, at least the Western world is ahead of us when it comes to women's right. And, I observe this pattern, these women who are not critical of the Western idea of Muslim women, they are often, praised by the Western world. And then they say that, see, our native country did nothing to promote our work, but the Western world can see our work. The US embassies in those Muslim countries, they give space to those women. So again, it's a very, sort of a intricate debate. And then, there was another Afghan artist. I was just looking at her Instagram handle, Fatima Hussaini. She's a wonderful artist, photographer from Afghanistan, who was rescued from Afghanistan. And recently she's in Paris. She moved to Paris after Taliban took control in Afghanistan. So she also sort of see that she thinks that we need Western intervention in Afghanistan to save the Afghan woman. And she is now heavily promoted by the Western world. She's going to by the way, recently there was in European Parliament, there was a conference going on Afghanistan, on Afghan women. And, they gathered all of the Afghan women who are, very popular on social media and who are doing incredible work as well. And they were having a talk with the white men there. And they were telling the white men that this is happening back home and we need your help to save us from the mess. So, yeah, the dynamics of the Muslim woman needs saving and the identity of Muslim women, it has totally changed in today's world.
Yeah, I mean, I think you bring up some really interesting points. Some years ago, and I know I talked to you about this before the recording. For my master's program, I did some work on the headscarf affair. So when I did my master's, it was I believe 2007 to 2008. And as you can imagine, doing this sort of work in the West, I'm obviously gonna, I'm kind of limited on the sort of resources that I can use based on the Western institution that I'm with. So I wanted to question the concept of the headscarf affair in France and the removal of la voile that they called in schools, especially in state education. And I was questioning this whole sort of idea behind sort of what I felt was a sort of like a hypocritical approach where you could wear a cross around your neck, but then you couldn't wear a headscarf. And I just thought, well, that to me seems quite contradictory because why can you have one and not have the other? So I read a book about, because I think the headscarf affair really sort of took off in 2004 and in France. And that's where I was focusing my research. And I read a book by a guy named Bowen who questioned sort of the policies behind it. And when I wrote this paper, I was required to look at Western feminist theory. And that seemed to, not that I particularly enjoy theory, I'll be honest, I really don't enjoy it. But I do know it has a purpose, even though some people treat theory as if it's fact. It's still theory. It hasn't been proven. Just going to throw that out there. But I was told I needed to have a massive portion of my research on the three waves of Western feminism. And I remember reading this only because my supervisor at the time had insisted that this was mandatory and feeling like this doesn't work. Like we're talking about white women in the 1950s compared to those in the 60s and 70s. And what does this have to do with women who aren't in the West? It just seems to me like we're talking about apples and oranges, and these are not remotely related. But because he was my supervisor and I didn't really have a choice, I read just like heaps and heaps and heaps of this material. And then it was only at the very end that I was able to dedicate time to the stories of the women who, like you said, they wore the veil out of choice. They wore that because they wanted to. And then trying to construct this argument where I felt was completely disjointed, but it was the box I needed to tick. And so when you started talking about how, we have these Western impositions, I just kept thinking about that paper and thinking, well, at least I'm not the only one that thought this was a crazy idea to somehow like merge these two very different approaches and then try to make sense of something that to me just didn't make sense at all. And I guess what I'd be curious to know from your perspective, because I am a little bit familiar with Abu Lakad and Saba Mahmoud and I think even Talal Mahmoud, if I said his name correctly. His work was the only one I actually felt like, it was the only one I could really find, for one. And then secondly, it was the only one I actually thought like had a non, I mean, he did a lot of work in the West, but at least I could step out of it just a tiny bit. I'd just be curious to know this idea of the sort of Western feminism. One of the things that sort of irks me is that we're kind of imposing ourselves onto others and we're not taking time necessarily to think about things from the other person's perspective. And I think it'd be interesting, at least for me, to understand what could feminism look like potentially from a non-Western perspective. And I realize it's a big question, the world's huge, but how do you think that might look? And what do you think it would be important for those in the West to understand?
All right, very interesting question. So before I answer this question, I would like to, share something with you that there's a professor at University of Bristol, Terrell Carver. Pardon me if I could not pronounce it right. He teaches gender studies there, and he wrote an article which stayed with me, and he said that feminism is a theory of woman oppression. So his argument basically was that we understand feminism through oppression of the woman, right? So
Okay.
how the so and then he came up with this proposition by by observing and by asking these questions from his seminar sized class where he taught feminist theory. So he would ask this question from very I think postgraduate students or graduate level students, I'm not sure. He would ask this question from their students, from his students, that who causes this oppression, and then he came up with a very very interesting conclusion that nobody directly blamed men. They would say it's sexism, it's patriarchy, it's culture, it's religion. And he was very intrigued by this, that where's the M word, and then I wrote an article to have a cross culture sort of a comparison, because I got this opportunity to teach feminist theory in Pakistan as well to a baby undergraduate students. And when we would talk about feminism, I think it would be one of the most interesting lecture of my semester. Everyone would participate and had a word to say, right? And you know what I observed, the women there in Pakistan, they would openly hold men responsible for their oppression. So that was very interesting. And I even shared this with Terrell. I shared this observation with him, and he gave me really kind feedback of that observation. So, and then I observed that maybe this was just my personal opinion and observation, that Islam as a religion has given them autonomy to think, independently, as compared to the white male, institutional structures, which are oppressive to women, which are intrinsically designed in a way to oppress women. This was just my observation. And then for me, what feminism is, again, coming back to the question, I think I could, I cannot, sort of explain that in a very explicit way or in very clear cut words, because it varies from person to person. Every other girl student and a boy student of of my university, they had the different idea of feminism in their head. So again, the idea of the feminism there is, and my students who were barely, I think they were first year students of their undergraduate degree, they would openly call themselves feminists. You would be surprised to know, because in the Western world, we would see that, oh my God, the women in the East are oppressed and they are sitting in their homes. No, they will openly talk about feminism. And there was a lot of, debate going on there in Islamabad, Pakistan. And there was a sort of a Aurat march as well, the women march. And they openly debate about the women's right. They even talk about the intersectional feminism. They even talk about the queer, rights in these women's marches. So again, things are changing for good. Women are on the streets. They are talking about feminism. They are challenging the patriarchal injustices. They are challenging those patriarchal laws that were put in place by the male men there. So, yeah, the idea of feminism, I think, in my society, in where I come from, it is very progressive. So,
Yeah, I mean, I think that's firstly, I think that's wonderful. But also, I think that it also speaks to the importance of how much the West doesn't know. And I think that is something that needs to be touched upon. I mean, um, it's like anything. I live in the UK and I grew up in the US. And so before I went to the UK, my experience was based on where I grew up. And where I grew up, the first thought wasn't guns and gun laws and people shooting each other. I mean, there's some areas where that could happen for sure. But I'm just saying that there were plenty of places where that wasn't the case. And then I moved to the UK. And now the only thing I ever hear about my home country is guns and everybody getting shot in the face. And it makes it seem like the US, as soon as you walk off the plane, you're dead. You're a dead man. And I know for a fact that if you go to my suburb of where I grew up, you won't be. I would hope not. But there is that's the message that's being sent to people, and I've had colleagues who are like, I'm not really interested in going, or they have. It's not. There's never anything positive, like news wise, that comes out of it. And then you start to realize, well, at least for me, it's like, but this is the same thing that the media is producing in other countries as well, is that they'll see a band of people. And I'm not saying that isn't, it shouldn't be addressed, but that's the only thing we're focusing on is that. And we're ignoring all these other discussions, like really interesting discussions, like you said, of women who are going on the streets and they're just holding up a flag and they're saying, look, we have a right to our opinions. And that there is more than just, one person. It's not a solitary person who's a radical, but that actually there are these debates happening. And I wonder sometimes, and I think it's a big question. I don't even know if there's an answer, but why in the West do we ignore that? And I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on that.
I think the responsibility is on the researchers and anthropologists as well, because we should try to research and study people in their diversity, in their particular regions and cultures and countries. For instance, I belong from a very suburb village in KPK province in Pakistan, right? We have tribes within our village as well.
Okay.
And within our village, even the tribes amongst a small village are very different. How their attitudes are, how their lifestyles are, how their eating patterns are, how they dress up. So just imagine if we paint one region, Middle Eastern Muslim countries, with the same brush, how restrictive this framework is.
Yeah. I mean, I think about this. It's funny you mentioned this, because I can remember years ago, because in the States you have different environments as well, different, what constitutes American versus one place versus another, right? And I can remember, even like dating somebody, and this person found out that I, came from a certain background, religious background, and he told his friends, and his friends were like, ooh, and I'm like, what's with the ooh? Like, I don't understand. And he's like, well, because in my podunk area where he grew up, there were assumptions that were made. And I was like, well, you need to step back and realize, A, I'm not from where you live, and B, like, who cares? And realizing that something that to me wasn't a big deal for him, it was. And, I think that it's interesting that those things aren't just limited to us. And I think that's the other reason these discussions need to be had. We're not so special. Like, there are other people who also have their own ways of handling things and, processing their cultures in their own way. And I think that is also worth addressing. But to get back to some of the other things we'd mentioned. So we've talked a bit about Western feminism. We've talked about some of the issues regarding, some of the dynamics involved. But I guess what I'd like to know from you is how, when addressing Western feminism, and we can always talk about other things as well, but how do you feel like it drowns out others' voices? Potentially.
Can you rephrase your question? Sorry.
Yeah. So we talked about the fact that, this idea of, the feminism in the West sort of taking over the discussion of how the West needs to be processed, how it needs to, kind of project itself into other countries in that savior complex you've talked about in the past. What I'd like to know from your perspective is, how does Western feminism have the potential to drown out those voices, the ones that you talked about before, where there are women in the streets who, are talking about people's rights, they're talking about, defending, not even defending, but like promoting their interests. How do you think as a Western community, we prevent those voices from being heard a bit more? So it's not just the media where we talked about before, but maybe taking it that step further and looking at it from a feminist perspective.
All right. I think before I, sort of answer this question, I would like to add this, what we were discussing earlier, that, what's the point of anthropology and what's the point of going to the far-flung areas when we have already decided what is good or bad for them, right? Like this is the problem, this was the problem with the, feminist anthropologist who researched the Muslim woman in the past, that they already had this preconceived idea in their head that, taking off hijab or taking off burqa is a form of liberation for the woman, without understanding what the native women want, right? So again, now coming back to your answer, which you just asked me, and to the question which you just asked me, I think it's again, like I said, that this debate about the feminist debates in the Muslim world, it has evolved a great deal, right? So another observation which was very interesting, that there are certain, West promotes certain feminist voices who blame religion for the oppression of the woman, for the misogynist practices. So if there are feminist voices in the Muslim world who blame Islam, right, or any other religion for the patriarchal injustices in the society, the Western world would promote those women, right? But like I said earlier, on the other hand, these secular feminist voices, they would suggest that, yeah, we need separation of the state and the religion, because religion, there's, reclaiming feminist rights within the religion has a lot of limitations, right? They argue this. So again, I'm not sure how to answer what you just asked, because it's so intricate. Because
Sorry, go on.
Even after this digital revolution, things are going on at very fast pace. Like I said, even in Pakistan, women are talking about the rights of the queer and non-binary gender people. I have friends who openly talk about the protecting the rights of the gender diverse people back home. So I think what the Western world shows us, that it's just tip of the iceberg, what is happening in the native areas. But again, due to the technology and due to these digital spaces like Instagram, TikTok, things are changing, right? The native approach or the native frameworks are being highlighted. They are being promoted. And I think these, digital natives, the thinking of the digital natives is changing. The Western digital natives, their thinking is changing about the East.
Okay.
So I think a lot of credit goes to these digital spaces, which provide you safe spaces to, openly talk about certain narratives.
Yeah. And would you say that these spaces could be a really good way to include non-Western feminism into the debate on women's rights?
Absolutely. Because I myself benefited from a lot of groups on Instagram, and where we have constructive debates surrounding this phenomenon. So yeah.
Perfect. Well, I know we could talk about this for ages and ages, but I have to say, Thank you so much. That's it from us at Coffee and Cocktails with your host, Dr. Ann Wand. And I'd like to thank Sonia again for her wonderful talk this afternoon. If you enjoyed listening to this fascinating show, make sure to like, subscribe, leave a review, and consider becoming a patron. Starting at £1 per month, patrons get early access to ad-free episodes, bonus content, video interviews, and much, much more. Just go to patreon.com/coffee and cocktails podcast and sign up today. Otherwise, that's it for now. Thanks for listening and have a great week.